Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in. So today I'm going to be talking about early applications from my own perspective as someone who successfully applied to UPenn as an ED applicant. And just a quick introduction to myself. So my name is Kevin Tan. I just recently graduated from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania just a few months ago, and I studied finance and business analytics at Wharton. Prior to that, I actually graduated from Xavier School in 2016. Then right after, I went to Philadelphia to study here at UPenn. And as I mentioned earlier, I applied early decision or ED to UPenn, and the rest is history. Before I start with anything, I just want to really talk about what the three different types of early applications are, which are mainly ED, EA, and REA, and how each of them are different from each other. So let's start with ED, or early decision. So with ED, you can only apply to one school as an early decision applicant. And it's also a binding application in that if you're accepted into a school that you apply ED to, you have to attend that school, and only that school. And you have to also withdraw all your other applications, whether or not decisions have already been made or they're still pending. A lot of schools have either one round of EDs or 2 rounds of ED. So essentially, with schools that have only one round of ED, most of their applications have a deadline at around the end of October or end of November. And for schools that have 2 rounds of ED, they'll have 2 different deadlines. So for round 1, they'll have either end of October or end of November deadlines. And for their second round, they'll actually have a deadline that's the same or similar to their regular decision deadlines, which is around the start of January. You can apply to only one of these 2 rounds if schools offer both. So for example, for UPenn, they only offer 1 round of ED, and their deadlines are around end of October, if I'm not mistaken, or end of November. And then for NYU, actually has 2 different rounds of ED. The first is deadline at around end of October and November, and the second is in the same deadline as the regular decision deadline, or around the same time, which is somewhere in the start of January of the next year. So results for ED, and not just ED, but also EA and REA and any early applications can be expected around middle of December. But again, it depends on the school, right? So like you should do your research in terms of that. So some schools that offer ED are UPenn, Brown, Columbia, Duke, NYU, Harvey Mudd, Swarthmore, and there's many more. Again, you should do your research depending on what schools you're interested in. Next is early action. So the difference between early action and early decision is that number 1, you're allowed to apply as an early action applicant to more than one school. So you can EA multiple schools, and it's also not binding. So if you're accepted into any of the schools that you decide to EA apply to, you don't have to go to them. And you also don't need to withdraw any of your other school applications if you're accepted into a school that you applied EA for. So some schools that have EA are MIT, U Chicago, Georgetown, and there's many, many more. I think EA is actually the biggest in terms, or most schools have EA compared to ED or REA, although that might be changing soon. But essentially, a lot of schools offer this, which is great because you have optionality and you can also apply early. The other and third option is restricted EA or restricted early action, or REA, which is basically something pretty interesting. So basically here, you can only apply early to one school. And what that means is that you're only allowed to apply to a single school as REA. And if you do REA, you won't be able to apply ED or EA anywhere else. Basically, that's the only school that you're restricted to applying to early. But the benefit for this is that if you're accepted into that school or whatever school that you apply to as REA, you don't have to choose to attend that school. So you can apply again in regular decision, and you also don't need to withdraw any of your other applications to other schools. So examples of schools with REA include Boston College, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, Harvard, and many other schools. And in my own opinion, I think that more schools are starting to kind of use this type of early application, so they're trying to transition from EA or ED into restricted early action. So just to clarify, what's allowed and what's not allowed. So what's allowed is you're allowed to apply to multiple schools as an early action applicant, so you're allowed to EA multiple schools. You're also allowed to ED one school and EA multiple schools. But then if you get into the school that you ED for, you won't be able to pick any of the other EA schools. So you have to pick that ED school if you get accepted. And you're also allowed to REA or restricted early action into one school. So what's not allowed, to be very clear, is you're not allowed to apply to multiple schools as an early decision or ED applicant, You're also not allowed to apply to multiple schools as an REA or Restricted Early Action applicant. You're not allowed to apply to one school as a Restricted Early Action applicant and apply to other schools as either EA or ED, because when you apply as an REA applicant, you can only apply to that one school in the early round. And you're also not allowed to apply early in general, so either ED, EA, or REA, and apply again to the same school in the regular decision applications. So if you send in your application in the early round of that year, you're not allowed to send in another application in the regular round of the same year to the same school. So you only have one chance for every school. I know that some people might be out there, they'd be like, oh, bragging sort of, that I didn't follow the rules. I applied ED or REA in multiple schools, but I got away with it. I'm still in college. I would recommend that you don't listen to them and you just don't try this. Just because schools, especially schools that are in close proximity with each other, they tend to communicate with each other. And if you're caught breaking the rules and applying ED or REA to multiple schools or breaking the rules, your offers will be rescinded. Your acceptances will be taken back and you won't be able to go to the schools that you worked so hard and you put so much time and money and effort into getting into. So it's just not worth the risk. Just don't do it. So there are 3 different outcomes from the early application rounds compared to the regular application rounds wherein there's only 2. It's either you get accepted or you get rejected. With the early application rounds, there are 3. So first is either you get accepted. Congratulations, you got into a school early, you don't have to stress out as much. Second is you get rejected, which is bad, but then it's still better than, getting rejected in the regular round, because at least you still can apply as regular decision applicant to other schools in the regular round. The third outcome that is different in the early round is that you can also get deferred. So if you get deferred, what that means is that your application is not yet rejected, but it's also not yet accepted. Instead, your application will be reevaluated in the regular decision application round, along with all the other regular decision applicants. Other schools, or some schools, will allow you to send in additional documents to update your early application before the regular decision applications come in, so that you don't, or you're in the same kind of like playing field or level playing field as the regular decision applicants. Again, this depends on the school. Some schools don't allow that. Some schools you have to kind of reach out to them before you are allowed to do that. So do your research or ask people based on whatever school you're interested in if you ever get to that point where you get deferred after your early application. So now let's talk about what are the pros and cons of applying early or sending in an early application. And again, I just want to put a side note here. This is all based on my own experience and my own opinions, so other people might not agree, but then this is what I think are the pros and cons. The pros. I think there are personally a lot of pros when it comes to applying early. Number one is that it shows your interest and commitment to the schools, because obviously you are basically, especially if you're applying early decision or ED, you are showing them that no matter what happens, I will commit to your school. And a lot of schools want to have high matriculation rates. What a matriculation rate is that it's the rate or the percentage of people who end up going to that school divided by the number of people who actually get accepted into that school. So they want to have a high rate to show that they're a desirable school. And in order to really lock in on those applicants or those people that they kind of give acceptances to, they would, do ED policies. And so because again, it shows commitment. So if you apply early, essentially you will have a higher chance of getting in, based on my own opinion, because it shows you're interested and committed, and schools want those type of people or those type of applicants. Another thing that I think is really useful in a more practical sense is that applying early helps you prevent cramming. So you don't have to cram. And if you apply early and finish your applications early, you'll need to spend less time when you're doing your regular decision applications, because again, as many people know, you will be able to recycle your essays and the many things that you worked on and finished for your early application with your regular decision applications, and you won't have as much of a hard time. So another thing that I think is really helpful is that applying early helps you plan ahead. So for example, if you don't get into the school that you applied to in the early round, whether it be ED, EA, or REA, you'll be able to carefully plan for the schools that you applied to in the regular decision round to make sure that you get something good, right? And even if you get an acceptance, say an EA acceptance that you can easily say no to if you choose, you will be able to still plan ahead in terms of what schools you want to apply to in the regular decision. So if you get an EA a good EA school, a decent EA school that you like already, you can maybe be a bit more daring and apply to much more difficult schools or lower acceptance rate schools in your regular decision, because you know that you have kind of like a fallback option with your EA acceptance. That, I think, is a very good thing. It gives you basically more options, and options are always great in life, right? Another thing that I think holds true for a lot of schools, but again, it depends on the school, is that acceptance rates tend to be higher in the early rounds than in the regular rounds. But again, I really need to highlight this. It depends on the school. So depending on whatever school you're interested in, do your research and look at the statistics and acceptance rates for each of the different rounds. But from my own experience, for UPenn, the ED acceptance rate is around 20% or higher every single year, versus the regular decision acceptance rate is less than 10%, around 7 to 8% every year. So for me, it was a no-brainer. I had to apply to UPenn in the ED round because I just felt that there was a much higher rate. And sure, there might be fewer people applying in the ED round, which is why the rates might be higher. But then there's also another statistic for UPenn specifically that states that half or 50% of the entire class in UPenn actually comes from the ED round, and the other 50% is from the RD round. And that's huge, considering that a lot more people apply in the RD round versus the ED round. So it just makes sense for you to apply ED for that type of school, because you're competing against fewer people and you have a higher chance of getting in the ED round. But again, it depends on each school, and you have to do your research before you make a decision. So the cons, I think there's only really one biggest one, which is that you'll have less time to prepare for your applications, obviously. And in order for you to really reach the deadline of ED, which is a few months earlier than a regular decision deadline, you need to plan ahead, especially when it comes to SATs and ACTs or other standardized tests, because these tests are usually only offered in testing centers once every month. So if you want to take the SATs or the ACTs more than once, you'll have to really start early so that you can take it more than once and really go and send in your highest score to these schools. Another thing is that you have to build your resume and your competitive edge really early on. You won't have a lot of time in your senior year, assuming that your senior year starts around June or even August. You won't have a lot of time to build your application in those few months of being a senior. So you really have to take advantage of your junior year or your summer after your junior year to strengthen your application. Personally, for me, I really decided to take the SATs and ACTs really early. I took them, I think, more than a year before I decided to apply early for Penn. So around September, October, the year before I applied to Penn. And that gave me enough time to take the SATs 3 times, and I got the highest score in the 3rd time, so thank God. And I also really made the most out of my junior year. I did an internship, I did a summer camp in Ateneo, and I did a non-profit startup and many things like that before I even got to senior year. And that gave me time to really prepare my application because I knew that I was going to ED Penn. So another thing that is a disadvantage is that if you decide to ED, the binding nature of ED really narrows your options. So for example, if you decide to ED a school and then you get into that school, you'll be required to go to that school. But let's say you happen to come across a new school that you think is even better for you. Unfortunately, you won't be able to apply for it anymore in the regular round because you have to go to the ED school. That's just how it works. And that's kind of unfortunate. So really do your research before you apply early. I guess the biggest question that you guys might be wondering right now is, should I apply early or not? And I guess these are some factors that I'd like to present to you when it comes to deciding whether or not to apply early. Number one is really, I think the most important factor to consider is how prepared your application is. I would recommend that you don't rush just to apply early. So don't basically send in a half-baked application just so you could apply early, just because the acceptance rates are much higher in the early round. I would much more advise you to wait for the regular decision round and send in a fully baked application in the regular decision round versus a half-baked application in the early decision round. That's just because you can only apply to that school once, right, in either round. So you can't apply again. And you have to send in your best application whenever you send it. So don't rush it. And if you're not prepared, don't worry, you still have regular decision. If you're prepared, then you might want to consider applying early. The second thing is really individual school statistics. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of schools tend to have higher acceptance rates in the early rounds than in the regular decision rounds. But again, it depends on every school. So you should do your research on whatever schools you're interested in and their statistics when it comes to acceptance rates. But I guess the common knowledge among students abroad and also people in camp is that many highly selective schools such as the Ivy League schools and big research institutions, tend to have higher early application acceptance rates than regular decision acceptance rates. But again, do your research, right? And then another thing you have to consider is if you're a legacy applicant, you might want to apply early. And just to clarify what that means, a legacy applicant is an applicant with older generation relatives like parents or grandparents who are directly related to you. So it doesn't apply as much to cousins, uncles, aunts, and all that. If your parents or older generation relatives directly related to you have attended or are affiliated with the same school that you're applying to, then you have a higher chance of getting in or getting considered to be accepted in the early rounds. So for example, if your mother or your father or your grandfather is a professor or worked at Penn or, went to Penn as well, and you're applying to Penn, then you'll have a higher chance of being considered into getting into Penn in the early rounds. And again, admissions officers and admissions committees don't tend to advertise this because it just seems very discriminatory, which it is in my opinion, but then that's just the reality of it. So if you're a legacy applicant, I would highly recommend you to apply early. Another thing you have to consider is financial aid, and financial aid in my opinion is much easier to get if you apply early, and that's just because you're competing with much fewer people, right? So in order for you to get financial aid, in my opinion, you have to really stand out as an applicant enough that the school that you're applying to is willing to actually give you money to go to that school, right? And the only way to do that is that you're just so good that they want you to be a part of their school. That's much easier to be. It's much easier to stand out and seem like a really good applicant when you're competing with fewer people. And it's very true. Fewer people apply early just because it's much harder, just because you have to be prepared much earlier. And that will increase your chances of standing out and getting financial aid. So if you need financial aid, I would highly recommend you to try to prepare your application as early as you can and apply early. Now, in my opinion, you should apply early if you fit one or two or three of these different bullet points. Number one is you should apply early, especially early decision, which is binding, if it's your dream school. And you are absolutely sure that this school is perfect for you based on the research that you've done. And by perfect, I mean not just academically, but also in terms of other adjustments that you have to make, like weather, or just people you know, or the communities and the clubs that you find in the school. If it's your dream school and you're sure it's perfect for you, then you'll be willing to commit to this school, and then you can apply ED. But even if you don't have to commit to that school, in general, it'll be good if you choose to apply early to a school that is in your top choice, so that you'll be less stressed in the regular decision round, right? So if you already got into a top choice school that is not binding, that is in EA or REA, then you can just shop around for other schools in the regular decision round and you won't be pressured, but because you know that one of your top school choices is already there for you, has already given you an acceptance. The other thing, and I think the most important thing you have to consider if you want to apply early, is that if you're a competitive applicant, meaning if you have a high standardized test score, SAT or ACT, you already have a fleshed out resume and a lot of amazing and outstanding activities, and you also have really fully baked essays before the ED application or early applications, and you think that you're confident that you would have a good chance getting into these institutions, then you should definitely apply early, because that's really the biggest roadblock and biggest bottleneck when it comes to applying early. It's that if you're not ready, you can't or you shouldn't apply early. But if you are, and you are confident that you're competent, then go do it. There's nothing stopping you, literally. The other consideration is if you're a legacy applicant or if you need financial aid. Again, I would highly recommend you to apply early, just because legacy is taken into account more in the early rounds, and financial aid is much easier to get when you're being compared to fewer people. In general though, I would recommend that you apply early. I think that if you're ready with your application, there is no point waiting a few more months to send that application in. You'll have a higher chance of getting in, assuming that fewer people apply and your acceptance rates are higher. And I just think that if you don't get in, at least you get to plan for the schools that you apply to in the regular decision round, which is a really great advantage in my opinion. So general tips for early applicants. Number one is start early. Start as early as you can. The moment that you know that you want to apply abroad and you want to take it seriously, already start reviewing for SATs, researching schools, looking at the Common App essay prompts, and thinking of what to write. And the earlier you can start, the earlier you can finish, and that also means the earlier you can apply, so you can reach the early application deadlines. And then another thing is to do as much research as you can, because again, you'll be committing 4 years of your life and a lot of money to this institution if you choose the ED, for example. So really show or find out for yourself what is an institution or a school that you want to be a part of, and then you can decide whether or not you want to commit or whether or not you want to apply early as well. And another thing to do is keep track of all important deadlines. So EA and ED and REA deadlines tend to differ much more than regular decision deadlines among schools. So it's really useful to really look at the dates of different schools and their deadlines and keep track of them. I would recommend using Google Calendar or an Excel sheet that lists all the schools that you're applying to early and their deadlines, just so you don't miss anything, because it's really gonna suck if you miss something. You're not gonna have another chance until next year, which is not gonna happen unless you take a gap year. So don't miss the deadlines. And then another thing I think that is not spoken to or spoken of enough is that if you're accepted early, make sure you don't slack off in school and you don't have really low grades too much, because this can actually jeopardize your chance of being accepted to the school. So what people don't talk about is that most schools will require you to send an updated version of your high school grades after you graduate or a few weeks before you get into that school or start studying in that school in August. And people who have had really big drops in their grades tended to have their offers or their acceptances rescinded in their schools. So basically what that means is that if your grades drop so much after you got in early, the school might just be like, well, this guy basically didn't put in the effort, or his application doesn't look that legit anymore because he scored so much lower in the future semesters, and they'll just decide to not get you into that school. They'll just take out your acceptance and you'll be left with nothing. So don't slack off too much. Make sure you still study, make sure you try to maintain your grades as much as possible, and also, of course, make sure you graduate high school. Another thing that you have to consider, which I already mentioned earlier, is that you should not take this option lightly. If you apply early, especially early decision, which is binding, you should definitely apply knowing that if you get in, you will be willing to commit, because you'll be committing 4 years of your life and also thousands of dollars at a particular institution. So yeah, that's basically everything that I wanted to talk about when it comes to early applications. And really feel free to shoot me an email if you want to connect or if you want to ask any other questions about ED, but not just about ED, anything about the application process. I've been there and many of my friends have been there, so we're all willing to help you with your applications, early applications or not. And really, that's my email, kevinkeithtan@gmail.com. Shoot me an email if you need. And that's really it. Good luck with your applications, guys. Stay healthy, stay safe, and keep dreaming.